I'm Patrick Watson, I'm an astrologer, and you're watching Annual Profections with Aries Rising. Thank you very much for buying this video. This is more or less the continuation or last part of my 12 different types of Aries Rising video series. So hopefully you enjoyed that, because we're going to be using a few of those examples in order to explore the technique known as Annual Profections. And we're going to be using this exclusively with Aries Rising charts to show how this works. So, we want to look at Annual Profections in order to answer the question, when is someone acting like their Ascendant ruler? Because people don't always act like their Ascendant ruler in every single situation. There seems to be more specific times of people's lives that they're more likely to act like that part of their chart, when they reach a kind of when they kind of live out their chart more fully and are more I guess in tune, or encountering the kind of the making their signature move. You know, I mean, if the Ascendant ruler, it describes your MO, then Annual Profections tell you when you're most likely to be most Mars-like, or most like your Ascendant ruler. So, Annual Profections highlight a particular sign, house, and ruler for each year of life. Using Annual Profections, we can tell what some of our most signature years might be like. Since we started with the Ascendant when we're born, each year of life corresponds to a sign, house, topic, and planetary ruler. So when Annual Profections come to the sign and house of your Ascendant ruler, that's when you should see the topics and associations of that house ruler come out more fully. So starting with the Ascendant when you're born, each year of life corresponds to a sign, house, topic, and planetary ruler. With Aries Rising, Mars will be highlighted in first house perfection years, ages 0, 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72, as well as in 8th house perfection years, age 7, 19, 31, 43, 55, 67, as well as at ages that correspond to the house position of your Mars. Here is a little diagram, basically, which shows you the ages at which you are when you are in a given perfection year. So as you can see, as I said before, you know when you're in a first house perfection by whether you're in a multiple of 12. And if you just remember those numbers, then you can generally figure out what year, what age you are in what year, and what house perfection you're in. So how to interpret Annual Profections. Each year of life centers on the topic of the house which is perfected. Transits through the annually perfected sign are the most significant for the year. Transits to and from the annually perfected ruler are the most significant for the year. And perfections can begin from any house or planet to see which transit will be the most significant for a given topic, but perfections from the Ascendant are likely the most relevant and noticeable. When starting Annual Perfections from an Aries Ascendant, reaching the sign that contains Mars is an opportunity to live out the potential of the Ascendant ruler, a kind of signature year. So I'm going to use a few of our old examples. So Chris Shama, he's the climber with Mars in Aries Rising, right? So he experienced the first house Annual Perfection at ages 0, 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72, etc. So those should be the years in which he has these sort of potential, realizes his potential. So at age 12, he went climbing for the first time. Tom Davis, the co-founder and co-owner of Pacific Edge Climbing Gym in Santa Cruz, said, "He started here at 12 years old, but by the end of the first year, we knew that he was something special." So age 12, aside from being the Jupiter return, which is likely, the Jupiter cycle is likely the base of the Annual Perfection cycle, but at age 12 was when he first started climbing. I mean, obviously this is important because he's a professional climber. At age 24, he actually had to leave bouldering behind after his mother died. So he moved to Mallorca and he began deep water soloing climbing, which is kind of, bugs. Get out of here. So he began deep water soloing climbing, which is one of the most dangerous types of climbing. Basically, it's where someone climbs over water. And so he basically left bouldering, which is climbing boulders, and he started instead. He graduated onto deep water soloing. So it was the next level. It was the next evolution in his climbing career. And then at age 36, on September 13th, 2017, he accomplished climbing Big Fish, which was the hardest and most dangerous deep water solo climb that has ever been attempted. And Uranus was at 27. It was very close to 28. 28 degrees of Aries, conjunct his Mars and Mercury, once in a lifetime transit, supercharging his unique Mars-Mercury ascendant ruler. We can also see that Jupiter is in opposition as well. And he was also doing this at a Mercury-Mars recurrence transit, because he has Mercury-Mars conjunct in the natal chart, and he has Mercury and Mars, at the conjunct. Even though they're not making an aspect, it's still a recurrence transit. There's the same aspect occurring in the sky that he has in his natal chart. So it was a very signature time from him. And was happening at the time of this once-in-a-lifetime transit, and he does this incredibly dangerous feat, climbing over this, doing this deep water solo climb. So, again, another first house annual perfection example is Juan Manuel Fangio, the racer. You can see his scar now. On the other photo, you couldn't. So, at age 12, in his first annual perfection year, he recalled the first time that he drove a car. He was in a garage where, like, the car wouldn't move. It was, like, on wheels, so it wouldn't move if you pumped the gas on, but you could still put the gas on. So, with my foot on the accelerator, I could call as much as 40 horsepower into play. Had I dared, I could have driven off and made 2 tons of metal answer to my will. I was shaking with excitement. It was just like Chris Shama discovered climbing. Juan Manuel Fangio discovered cars. Age 24, his next annual perfection year was the year of his first professional races. At age 36, he moved to Europe and he began Formula One racing. And then at age 48, he began his first year of retirement, and he did these victory laps where he re-raced the old tracks he raced on. And then at age 60, he drove through old races in original cars to capture footage for his own biopic, Fangio. So he's sort of his signature, right? Age 72, we don't know exactly what happened, but at age 84, his last one, he died on July 17th, 1995. So sometimes you see that, maybe especially in this case because Mars also rules the 8th, but yeah, we can see how his his life seems to be pretty well organized by this annual perfection cycle. Guy Ligier, the second house guy, this is the businessman who made his own cars, the race car manufacturer. So at age 13, we don't know exactly what he was doing, but it's possible that this is when he began working as the butcher's assistant, because he was already working as a butcher's assistant by 14 years old. So this is when he began saving money to buy a bulldozer. So it's very possible that age 13 is when he began working as a butcher. We also don't know exactly what was happening at age 25, but we know that he had his first race in the next annual perfection cycle, which indicates that he probably had been working to prepare for this during the second house annual perfection. And then at age 37, he formed Ligier Cars. So he started his car manufacturing business. His business partner died in a car crash when Saturn was conjunct his ascendant, and he named the cars after his friend's initials. Age 49 was the year of an infamous racing season where his cars were dominating, the Ligier cars, but then they were followed by inexplicable defeats and consequent financial consequences. And then at age 61, he had to sell his business due to incoming French politicians who were hostile to his business. So he had to leave Formula One racing and he moved into the fertilizer industry. So that all happened in the year that he was 61. And then at age 73, he returned to Formula One racing by purchasing a automobile company, Martini, and then he died during his last one at age 85. So we can see how he kind of lived out some of the potentialities and possibilities of his Mars and second during these key years when Taurus was perfected as the second house annual perfection. Kathleen Kennedy, she's the movie producer, so her third house perfections should be the most significant ones because she has Mars ruling her ascendant in the third house of Gemini. And so at age 26, that was the year which she began working in collaboration with Steven Spielberg. This is when she kind of met him. This is the beginning of her collaboration with him. And so this makes sense. This is how I realized that she, was kind of living out her ascendant ruler to begin with. And then it just so happened that it would happen during the year that she actually had her Mars perfected, as an annually perfected planet by being in the third house in a third house perfection. The next time she had a third house annual perfection, she began working. She began her own production company. So this is kind of like the result or consequence of the connections and collaborations that she made, was to begin her own production company with her husband. At age 50, this one really vexed me. I could not find out exactly what happened. There wasn't a story about it. I have no idea why age 50 would have been significant for her necessarily. Seabiscuit was released in this year, which she produced, but otherwise it's unknown. However, at the next one was the release of Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens, the first movie produced by Lucasfilm since the Disney acquisition and since Kennedy became producer. So this was like the first really big test of her, like everything that she'd sort of been working towards, and it was a fantastic success financially, and more or less critically by fans. So I think that's just interesting that her third house Gemini perfection seemed to be pretty illustrative. At least I know about age 50, but maybe we'll find out someday. Isabelle Adjani, we talked about her before, about how her Mars in the fourth house was instrumental for understanding like her relationship with her family, as well as her discomfort with her French identity and her connection to her father's homeland of Algeria. And so during a fourth house perfection, which highlights the topics of home and origins and parents, her father died. And a biographer said about her, she said it was only after her father's death that Adjani felt free to explore her Algerian origins. So, her father didn't really want her to, because I think he wanted her to be able to adapt and merge with French life, but she finally did, explore her Algerian identity, after her father died. And that's also when she decided to come out very publicly and say that she was Algerian, after she saw the rise of nationalism, in France. Now, I didn't know what happened in the intervening years, but very recently I realized that she is in another fourth house perfection, and this is actually when she began shooting in October of 2018. She began shooting her first movie in Algeria as an Algerian woman telling the story of the death of her father. So, I mean, art imitates life, life imitates art, etc. Like, she's dealing with this topic again, even as a much older woman. It's still relevant. It still comes up in a kind of unexpected way. So I thought that was really interesting. Bette Midler, when her ascendant rule is in the fifth house, we kind of talked about how that describes how she's sort of a brassy, showbiz lady, and we can see that these perfection years don't happen all that often, and so it's remarkable because she only had one child, and the year that she had that child just happened to be in a fifth house perfection year. So at age 40, no less, she got pregnant somewhere around February to early March of 1986, and her daughter was born that year while her fifth house was perfected for that year. Tom Daschle, has Mars in the 6th house. And this is kind of interesting because this would suggest problems with injuries or illnesses, duties, employees, inferiors. And so I didn't know much about him, but one thing that really stuck out to me is the fact that at age 53, during a 6th house profection, he was one of the few specified targets of an anthrax attack in October 2001. On June 21st, 2001, he had co-signed a letter publicly questioning the efficacy and prudence of an anthrax vaccine program, and the FBI investigation ultimately found Bruce Ivins to be guilty of the anthrax attacks, who was an employee of the anthrax vaccine program that Daschle had criticized. He and the Ivins guy, he staged those attacks in order to prove to Daschle and others that the anthrax vaccine program was worth keeping. And while Daschle himself was not harmed by the anthrax, some of his staffers and aides were contaminated by the anthrax. So, it was basically a disgruntled employee who tried to, take a swipe at him and ended up hurting Tom Daschle's staffers. And, so it is a very Mars and 60 type event. It's interesting to consider why that be considered like a signature move. It seems to be more of a side note, but it must have been pretty scary to know that, you've been specifically targeted for an attack by, some random person in a government vaccine research program. So that is, I think, an interesting example of a 6th house perfection for highlighting the ascendant ruler. John Lennon, we talked about how his Mars in Libra in the 7th sort of shows how he's acting against type, right? He's, instead of Mars being a warrior, Mars in Libra is like a peace warrior. And so what's interesting about that is at age 18, we know that, he was abusive towards his partners. And at age 18, he slapped his fiancée Cynthia, and there she broke off their engagement before they got back together that year. And that was just one little event that I found, but I wonder what sort of maybe the broader importance of it was. At age 30, this is when he recorded his first post-Beatles album with his new wife, Yoko Ono, the John Lennon Ono Plastic Band album, which featured the scream singing, this very martial scream singing, and celebrating his separation from the Beatles. And later that year, or in the year that he was 30, he recorded Imagine, which is his signature song, and he called it an anti-religious, anti-nationalistic, anti-conventional, anti-capitalistic song, but because it's sugar-coated, it's accepted. So, this way that he distinguished himself through this song, which is, a very Marsy song in some ways, but in this, sugary Libra context, he wrote that while Libra was perfected. And, why was this one more important than the others? Uranus and Pluto were both in Libra at the time, approaching his sun, I believe, at least with Uranus. So, those planets became activated and important in his chart when he was in a 7th house Libra perfection. Huntress Thompson, we talked about how, his Mars kind of made him sort of a paranoid figure and kind of obsessed with, sordid things. And we also know that the 8th house is a house of death, and that he became kind of increasingly reclusive. And he shot himself in the head and died during an 8th house perfection. So that is a very unfortunate manifestation of his ascendant ruler. And I just thought it was such an impressive example of the 8th house as a one that rules death, that I just I didn't really look at his other annual perfections for the 8th house. You can if you want, but I just wanted to find a good example for each one, and that seemed to stick out to me. This is an interesting one. So Lucille McLaughlin, this is an interesting example of a transition from an 8th house to a 9th house perfection. So her ascendant is ruled by Mars and Sagittarius 9th, right? And so at age 31, she was in an 8th house Scorpio perfection. And so in this year, she moved from the UK to Saudi Arabia to take a nursing job. The ruler of the 8th is Scorpio, or is Mars, which is in the 9th. So this is when she actually made the move, when the ruler was active. But the 8th house itself is kind of corrupting and criminal, right? So she was falsely accused of murdering a fellow nurse and was arrested during the retrograde, transiting pre-retrograde Mars, a square Mars, and there was this sham trial which resulted in the sentence of 8 years in prison, 500 lashes, and she got sentenced that on the transiting post-retrograde Mars, square Mars. So Mars was active for the year since Scorpio was the perfected sign, and it introduced these topics of travel because a natal Mars is in the 9th, but also these topics of the 8th, like a death and a murder and accusation of murder, like criminal elements. Now, in the very next year, she entered the 9th house Sagittarius perfection, in which she has a very well-supported Jupiter, because it's a day chart and it's in its own exaltation in the 4th house. And so, what do you think happens? So this she has this sham trial. The sham trial and imprisonment caused this international controversy about Saudi justice, and this again sort of speaks to her general ascendant ruler, the fact that it's in the 9th, and she had this trouble in foreign lands, and she even married her fiance in prison that year at age 32, which is interesting when you consider that Venus, the ruler of her 7th, is in Sagittarius that year, so it introduced that topic of relationships to that year. And King Fahd commuted their sentences, and they returned back to the UK on 5/22/1998. And of course, so 9th house is ruled by Jupiter in the 4th, so she was miraculously let go and got to go back home. It would be interesting to see in the charts of prisoners, how, what perfections they're under when they get locked up versus when they get released. But I mean, this seems pretty clear. Like, the 8th house perfection was, ruled by Mars and Mars in the 9th. She traveled from this place and got in trouble, and then Sagittarius itself became active, became the annually perfected sign, and Jupiter and Cancer took over, and she got to go back home. Mia Tyler is the daughter of Steven Tyler from Aerosmith, and I noticed she had her ascendant ruled by Mars and Capricorn in the 10th, and so I started researching her because I thought, well, I wonder what she's about. And in her autobiography, she described at age 21, she described a suicide attempt before turning 22, which was stopped by a phone call which offered her a job. And this is the way she began her book, saying that this is the moment she decided to carve out her own identity. And this is kind of important for her too, because she's the daughter of Steven Tyler, and that seems to be like a kind of recurring theme. She wants to individuate herself from where she came from. She wants to, chart her own path. So, at her next 10th house perfection, she held a series of art exhibitions beginning in 2012. And what's interesting in that time is that she had Pluto on her midheaven conjunct her Mars and Capricorn with Uranus square it. And I was kind of wondering, well, what on earth, is this about? Like, what could have been so kind of crazy or awful about, this art show? But it turns out that, the theme of her art show was like this gas mask and like apocalyptic kind of aesthetic. Like it was all based on these kind of creepy images and these bringing up these notions of apocalypse and extinction and so it instead of Pluto, Mars, I guess. And it's funny because actually in that same year, her New York show was so packed and got so rowdy, filled with people in gas masks, survival gear, and things that look like weapons. The police had to shut it down over safety concerns. So I had the transits of that event against her chart. And I just think it's interesting that, in the year that she, has her ascendant ruler in the 10th perfected, that she does have this big public exhibit, that kind of goes wrong, when the police have to get involved, and the nature of the artwork itself from the art exhibit is, on this very kind of Mars, Pluto, and Capricorn theme of apocalypse and gas masks and stuff. Now we're back at Craig Newmark's chart. So his during his one of his last 11th house profections, he incorporated Craigslist as a for-profit company, and he relinquished control of the company. He'd initially resisted making Craigslist into a for-profit company because he didn't want to sell out. And ultimately, he split Craigslist into a private company and let other people manage it while forming a non-profit, the Craigslist Foundation, to pursue his own philanthropic aims with the boatloads of cash he was making and is making. And so what's interesting is on the day that Craigslist was incorporated as a for-profit company, when he basically essentially sold out or decided to let it all go, was when Uranus was on his Mars. So transits to Mars are, the perfected transits of the year. And you can see how he doesn't even need to rule anything to still be, impacted by this transit from Uranus. It's still in the perfected sign. And of course it had to do with, the organization of his businesses, of his aims. He wanted Craigslist to be, his philanthropic thing, or his, sort of more, he didn't want to sell out, but he finally ended up having to kind of split the difference. And, of course, Mars is all about splitting and dividing. And so he had to kind of blow up his idea of kind of keeping Craigslist as a kind of free and independent enterprise, not a boring corporation. But we can kind of see that in this perfection and also through the transit, which is perfected. Now back at Peter Piot's chart, he has Mars in the 12th. Shows his interest is in suffering and diseases, and at age 35 he co-founded the first international AIDS research program. And at age 47, he was appointed leader of UN AIDS in 1986. And then at his next 12th house perfection, he resigned from that position. So I think the 12th house perfection just shows, how, this sort of chronicles his timeline of, fighting these diseases and fighting suffering in foreign places. That seems to think. I think that's a pretty good example of how that kind of works out. Now, for this next part, I'm going to be looking at people who have planets in Aries in the first house, and seeing what happens when those planets are activated by perfection as rulers. So it's a little different. Now we're not just focusing on when the ascendant ruler is contacted, but when planets that are in Aries in the first house get activated as perfected rulers. So this guy, one of our first examples, Alexandre Biamonti, the karate guy with Mars and Aries rising. I don't know why I justified it like that. Okay. At age 24, during a first house annual perfection, that was when he first won the Karate World Championship during his first house annual perfection. So obviously Mars rules Aries, so when he encountered, an Aries annual perfection, then Mars was, doubly, important that year. So it's ascendant ruler, but it was also a planet in the sign of the perfection. So with Rihanna, she has Venus in Aries, and when she got to a second house perfection, Venus became active as a Time Lord. So at 25, what's interesting is at 25, this was the year that she first partnered with a company to create cosmetic products, to release a new makeup line. And so this was her first venture into the cosmetics industry. And of course, Venus is, cosmetics. And the second is finances and products stuff. And what's interesting is that even though she was already a multimillionaire, 2013 was the year of her Diamonds World Tour. which earned her more money in 1 year than she ever had earned before or since. So even in her very rich life, in previous Annual Profections, it still stood out as a banner year for her money. It still stood out as her most highest earning year possible. So I thought that was really interesting because, I was kind of like, well, what's so special then about a second house Annual Profection when you're already making millions every year? And it's like, well, I guess it's just more. Like it was a particularly good year for Rihanna in 2013. So that's an example of how when the second house is perfected, when the ruler of the second is in the first house, how that can work out sometimes. So Helmut Kohl, he's the German reunification leader. So he has Mercury rising in the first house. Now he also has a sun, Uranus, and Venus as well, but I'm going to focus on his third house perfection. So the third house is about siblings and friends and neighbors. And at age 14, he had a third house annual perfection. And it was in November of 1944 that Helmut's brother Walter died at war. And now what's important to note about this is that Walter, I think any child would be sad if this happened to them, but Walter had particularly idolized his brother. And he even said later, Walter's early death was a life-changing experience. And he said, this biography said that his dead brother's memory drove Kohl's pursuit of peace in a united Europe, and in September 1984 hung over the image of Kohl holding Mitterrand's hand in the military cemetery in Verdun, a symbolic moment of reconciliation between two former sworn enemies. And Helmut even named one of his sons Walter after his brother. So what's clear to me is that when he got to the third house, Annual Perfection, this highlighted the topic of Mercury and of brothers, and that this is when his brother passed, and that this had this massive, impact on the young Helmut Kohl, and that this even tied into his later aims about bringing peace, because he knows that, he knew that war and divisions, what cause people to die, so it's I thought that was kind of interesting that that his brother was such an impacting force to him, especially in losing his brother. So this is another really happy one. So this guy, Brian Keith Shaw, is an athlete, basketball player. He's got Mars and Aries rising, so no surprise there. He has the moon in Aries. And so the moon should theoretically import significations of fourth to the first house. So during a fourth house perfection year, at age 27, his parents and sister were in a terrible car accident, and the only survivor was his 9-month-old niece, who he immediately took on as his own child. So in one devastating blow, he lost his parents and became a parent. And if we look at his moon, the rule of the fourth is directly applying to his contrary sect Mars. And this is exactly, and actually at his solar return, Mars was exactly at 14 Cancer in his solar return. So, you can kind of see that, when you overlay the solar return with the annual perfections, that you get sort of more, information like that. This doesn't happen to everyone who has a fourth house annual perfection with Mars and the moon in the first house. But, it also has happened with that combination. So, that's a real bummer. And you can see how that, brought the topic of home and parents and family, to a, really bad level of prominence in his life. So with Samantha Fox, this one's kind of interesting. So she has the sun rising in Aries, and she has Mars in Aries as well. She's this, sort of rocker chick, former pinup model, glam model, and so technically that sun in Aries is ruling issues to the fifth, so it imports issues of the fifth to the first. So during a fifth house perfection year, at age 16, she found out about a competition to become the next page 3 glamour model, and then she took pictures the next day to send in. In January of 1983, her picture was selected out of tens of thousands of submissions, and then in later that month, she took photos for this, photographer for this competition, and they asked her, even though she's 16, the mom was okay with this, apparently. She took topless photos for the photographer, and he promised her they would stay private, but then when the newspaper was published, the newspaper released the topless photos of her, on page 3, and that was kind of the start of her career as a pinup glamour model, a sex symbol, and later a singer and actress, and so it's just, she became the sex symbol overnight, and it was in this fifth house, Annual Profection, ruling the topics of sex and pleasure and recreation, and this kind of event, made her the object of lust by, the boys at a school and the men across the country. And it's honestly kind of strange because she was 16, when it happened. But I mean, the 1980s were a crazy time. I think some people might be wondering, like, well, how was she Marzi? And as I learned more about her, she was actually she's been trained in martial arts since she was a child, and the only other career she would have wanted to have was to be a cop. So, I mean, there it is. There's the Mars and Aries again. But the sun seems to have changed things up a bit for Samantha Fox. Okay, so Chris Shama again. He has Mercury in the first house, right? So Mercury should import significations of the sixth to the first. And so during a sixth house annual perfection, at age 17, he said, I had a bad knee injury when I was about 17. I wasn't able to climb for about 6 months. It was kind of like a transformative time for me because it was really hard for me not to be able to climb. It forced me to appreciate things without just climbing. And in that time, Saturn conjoined Shama's Mercury and Mars 3 times between the dates of his sixth house annual perfection. So, pretty on the nose, I think. Like, that is the sixth house highlighted the topic of injuries, and then, that injury happened, while this transit was happening from Saturn, and, it's in his first house, conjunct his first house ruler, so he's, just totally brought that right to the forefront. Shaquille O'Neal, he is born with Aries rising, and he's only been married once in his life. Even though he's had a lot of relationships, he's only been married once, and he just happened to get married at age 30 during a seventh house annual perfection. And so with Venus rising in Aries, Venus imported the significations of the seventh of weddings and partnerships to the first house. And so the one marriage he had in his life happened, at a Venus-Mars conjunction opposite his natal Mars and his ascendant ruler. This is an interesting one. So Dennis Coleman was a guy who was so in love with his girlfriend that she was able to convince him to kill her mother, and he did. So he has Mars in the first house, and the eighth house was perfected, so it imported the topics of the eighth of death and crime and taboos and things like that. So at age 19, he was convinced by his girlfriend to kill her mother, and that's what he did. He murdered his girlfriend's mother during his eighth house annual perfection. And he had some interesting transits going on with his Mars at the time. So for David Souda, we talked about how, he has Jupiter rising in the first house, even though he has Mars ruling the Ascendant. And so what's interesting about that is that during ninth house perfections, he kind of had these jumps in his career. So as a legal professional, so at age 32, he was promoted to Deputy Attorney General in New Hampshire. At age 44, he was appointed to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. That was his first huge jobship, and he did not get appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court during one, but after he had entered the Supreme Court, he was formally abandoned by conservatives after a slew of more liberally slanted rulings. The Conservative Weekly Standard claims Souda betrayed them in November 1995. So there's a November 1995 Weekly Standard article that basically says, we've been betrayed. Like, it was sort of, I mean, there was buzz about him doing it before, but it seemed to come to a really big head in late 1995. And Souda's record even became a campaign issue for conservatives in the 1996 GOP primary election, because they were all kind of arguing amongst themselves about, are you going to pick another Souda? Like, are you going to, are you a real conservative? Because if you're a real conservative, you won't, nominate people like Souda who just, turn out to be like liberals in conservative clothing or something like that. So it's interesting that kind of crystallized that point when Jupiter in his first house was activated. And there was also he also had some papers of his get published in some foreign law journals or something. It was this big honor. So there was something else like that. At age 68, obviously, I mean, we don't know exactly when he expressly intended to retire, but the earliest rumors of officially retiring came during his next ninth house profection. So he expressed in early 2008 that he would be the first to retire after the 2008 election. That was the first time it sort of appeared in print. So it was probably the first time he'd really talked about it to anyone. Now we have Joseph McCarthy again with Saturn, ruling the 10th and 11th and the 1st. So I'm actually going to use him as an example for both the 10th and the 11th, because it's interesting how this sort of comes out differently. So during his 10th house annual profection, this was the year when his career basically ended. This is when he was given the ultimate humiliating public rebuke by Joseph Welch, who was the special counsel to the U.S. Army, in response to McCarthy's claim of communist infiltration in the U.S. Army. So, Welch effectively ended the Red Scare overnight and ended McCarthy's career with the following words. He said, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency?" And so this happened, when Mars was retrograde, close to his midheaven and coming into a square with his Saturn, and then Neptune itself was on the degree of his Mars, so it's sort of like dissolving his, entire reason for being, wasn't. I mean, he never came back from it. It was it was the end of the insanity that he had wrought on American politics in that time, and so Saturn kind of put a stop, in a sense, to that he reached the height of his career, and it was not going to improve after that point. When he moved into the 11th house annual profection, that was when he was formally censured by the Senate. So it was his allies and professional associates, they didn't bestow him with a gift or an award, but a mark of shame and dishonor. And so, that's reflected by the fact that Saturn's in full, and it was, directly towards him. So it says, the biographer said, after ascension, McCarthy continued senatorial duties for another 2.5 years, but his career as a major public figure had been unmistakably ruined. His colleagues in the Senate avoided him. His speeches on the Senate floor were delivered to near empty chamber or received conspicuous displays of inattention. McCarthy's biographers agree that he was a changed man after the censure, declining both physically and emotionally. He became a pale ghost of his former self, in the words of Fred J. Cook. So, and then not too long after that, he died. So, it's interesting to see. It's interesting to consider like how in the 10th house perfection he suffered this big blow to his career and reputation, and then in the 11th he was like formally censured, by his allies and peers. It's like not even his own like allies in the Senate like would respect him as a senator. So it was Saturn came to town for Joseph McCarthy in the end. And then our final example is Laurent Segalat. He has the ruler of Mars. Sorry, he has the ruler of Aries in the 12th house of suffering, and but he also has Venus and Jupiter rising in Aries. So it's interesting what happened in his 12th house annual perfection. He was imprisoned Yeah, he. So, oh yeah, yeah. So what you got to know about this is he was like a microbiologist, like a scientist, and he was accused of killing his mother-in-law, and there was a bunch of shady circumstances at the scene that really suggested that it was him, and it became this huge, long legal battle. He was arrested for it for like 29 months before they finally decided to release him. Because what happened was once he got to his 12th house annual perfection, there was a report that came out which cast doubt on his guilt. So he was already in prison, but a new report came out saying that he was fine, and so he got released in July 2011. And after that point, he legally traveled to France. And then when he got into his first annual perfection, Switzerland decided this is where the crime happened. It was in Switzerland. He basically Switzerland said, well, even if you're not here, we're going to retry you, and we find you guilty officially, even though you're already gone. And Switzerland launched this international arrest warrant for Segalat, and France refused to extradite him. So the reason why this is relevant is basically it seems like Mars put him in danger. Well, Mars put him in danger. Venus and Jupiter are protective. So like when he was in the Pisces annual perfection, Mars was there, but Jupiter was ruling, so he was let out of prison. And of course, the 12th house is related to the concepts of prison and being in isolation. But when he got to the Aries annual perfection, Switzerland was like, hey, wait a sec, you get back to prison because Mars is ruling. It's like, you got to go back to prison. But because Venus and Jupiter are in the sign, he was more or less protected because he had legally traveled to France after being apparently exonerated by this new report that surfaced. So he's now the center of this kind of debate in France about how to prevent future instances of French convicts living in foreign countries legally avoiding prison by returning to France. He's essentially legally avoided prison, presuming, of course, that he is guilty, which they seem to not be able to establish whether or not he really was. So I think this is an interesting example of how Jupiter imports the topics of the 9th and the 12th to the first house. And of course, he traveled in that time of the Pisces annual perfection. He traveled back to France, and it also highlighted the topic of him getting out of prison, which is Jupiter ruling the 12th. So it's an interesting example, I think, of how the 12th house annual perfection kind of highlighted what Jupiter represents, in a very sort of personal and unique way. So I want to thank you for watching. I just want to let you know that I am available for consultations and tutoring. Just go to www.patrickwatsоnastrology.com for more of my content. And if you like videos like this, please support me on Patreon to keep the content coming. I am planning to go through all 12 signs so that I will have a survey of all 144 Ascendant and Ascendant ruler combos. It's a really massive job, so if you want to help me continue coming up with those, please support me on Patreon. And I am so happy for your support, and I hope you got a lot of this. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll be out with more stuff eventually. Thanks.